It started the way Washington crises always start now, not with a formal statement, but with a burst of headlines, clipped video, and just-in chatter, spreading faster than anyone can confirm what's real. The claim moving through the news cycle is that John Brennan is backing talk of the 25th Amendment, and that this is happening as Iran-related fallout hits the White House and the political temperature spikes. Before we go any further, here's the key point. Unless and until there's a verifiable, on-the-record quote, video, transcript, or primary source statement, you should treat Brennan backs the 25th as a developing report or commentary claim, not a settled fact. But even the conversation matters, because the 25th Amendment isn't just a constitutional mechanism, it's a political signal. When it enters the public bloodstream, it tells you something bigger is happening. The system is testing whether a crisis remains external or becomes internal. That's what makes the combination Iran crisis, fallout, plus 25th Amendment talk so volatile. Iran-linked crises, whether they're about escalation risk, maritime disruption, oil prices, attacks, or diplomatic breakdown, don't stay neatly in foreign policy lanes. They hit markets, they hit military posture, they hit alliances, and then they hit the most sensitive arena of all, domestic legitimacy. And once legitimacy becomes part of the fight, every action gets interpreted through a new lens. Not what is the smartest move, but who looks in control. Now add John Brennan to that mix. Brennan is not a random commentator. He is widely known as a former senior intelligence official, a figure who carries weight with certain audiences and triggers instant backlash with others. When someone like that enters a conversation about presidential capacity, even indirectly, it functions like fuel. It transforms an argument from policy disagreement into fitness and authority, which is a different kind of political weapon. And here's why the 1 hour ago framing is so important to channels like your competitor. It creates a sense of a ticking clock. It implies the system is moving right now, behind closed doors, and you're catching it in the moment. That feeling drives clicks. But more importantly, it drives attention, and attention is what turns fringe talk into mainstream pressure. So tonight, I'm going to do what most coverage won't do. I'm going to separate the noise from the mechanism. What does the 25th Amendment actually require? Who has to act? What counts as incapacity in practice? Why would Iran fallout be the trigger for even discussing it? And what signs would tell you this is a real institutional push, or just political theater, designed to weaken an opponent during a foreign policy storm? Because the uncomfortable truth is this. In modern crises, the foreign policy event is often only half the story. The other half is how that event is used by allies, by opponents, by bureaucracies, by media ecosystems to reshape power at home. That's what makes this moment worth watching, even if the specific Brennan claim turns out to be overstated. When the 25th Amendment enters the conversation during an external crisis, it means someone is trying to convert foreign policy pressure into domestic political leverage. And once that conversion begins, the crisis doesn't de-escalate cleanly. It mutates. Let's get the mechanics straight, because the 25th Amendment is one of the most misunderstood tools in American politics, often invoked like a slogan, rarely explained like a process. When people say 25th Amendment, they usually mean Section 4, the part that deals with a president who is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office, but does not voluntarily step aside. This is not the same as impeachment. Impeachment is a political legal process for alleged wrongdoing. Section 4 is framed around incapacity, a functional inability, not necessarily a crime. Here's the core requirement. The vice president and a majority of the principal officers of the executive departments, commonly understood as the cabinet, would have to transmit a written declaration that the president is unable to perform the duties of the office. At that moment, the vice president becomes acting president. But it doesn't stop there. The president can contest it by sending a written declaration that no inability exists. If that happens, the vice president and the cabinet majority can reassert their declaration. Then Congress becomes the arena, and a 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate is required to keep the vice president as acting president. Without that 2/3 threshold, the president regains authority. That structure matters because it reveals something most people miss. Section 4 is designed to be hard. It requires alignment across the executive branch and a supermajority in Congress if contested. That's by design, because it is meant for extreme situations where capacity is a real and urgent concern, not routine political conflict. So what role does a figure like Brennan actually have? No formal role, none. Brennan is not in the cabinet. He cannot trigger Section 4. That's why when headlines say someone like Brennan backs 25th talk, what they mean is he may be influencing the conversation, validating it for certain audiences, or giving rhetorical cover to politicians or commentators who want the idea normalized. That's why this matters as a narrative event even before it becomes an institutional event. In Washington, normalization is the first step in power moves. People introduce an idea as discussion, then it becomes concern, then it becomes pressure. and only then does it become process. Now let's tie this to the Iran angle. Iran-related crises create the kind of atmosphere where capacity narratives thrive because they introduce fast-changing threat environments, high-stakes military decisions, market-moving uncertainty, and constant real-time information warfare. In that environment, political opponents can frame decisions as reckless or incoherent. Supporters can frame decisions as decisive and strong. Bureaucracies can leak, posture, or distance themselves. And commentators can frame the entire situation as proof that the country is being mismanaged. The 25th Amendment becomes attractive as a talking point in that atmosphere because it bypasses normal policy debate and jumps straight to the most visceral question. Is the person in charge capable of steering through a crisis? That is the psychological shortcut. It's a way to say, we don't just disagree, we believe the decision engine is broken. But remember, for Section 4 to move beyond talk, you need to see signs of something far more concrete than cable news outrage or social media trending. You'd need to see credible reporting about vice presidential posture, cabinet coordination, congressional whip counts, and legal preparations. Without those, what you're watching is political signaling, not constitutional action. And that brings us back to the title framing. Iran crisis fallout hits Trump. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It suggests the Iran situation is not just a foreign crisis, but a domestic vulnerability, one that opponents believe can be exploited right now. Now let's answer the question that actually matters. Why would Iran fallout be the kind of trigger that produces 25th Amendment chatter in the first place? Because Iran-related crises tend to create what strategists call a multi-domain stress test. It's not one problem, it's several, stacked together. Military risk, air-sea operations, force protection, escalation, economic shock, oil prices, shipping risk, inflation sensitivity, diplomatic strain, allies demanding clarity, adversaries probing seams, and information warfare, propaganda, false claims, selective leaks. When you put those domains together, you create a governing environment where small mistakes become big ones, and big decisions have to be made fast. That is exactly when opponents reach for capacity arguments, because capacity arguments are the only arguments that attempt to delegitimize the decision maker rather than the decision. Here are 3 realistic ways an Iran crisis can turn into a domestic power struggle. 1. The competence narrative breaks. If an administration appears inconsistent, celebrating progress one hour, scrambling the next, promising stability, then confronting disruption, announcing deterrence, then reacting to shocks, opponents will frame it as evidence of drift. It doesn't matter whether the drift is real. What matters is whether it becomes plausible to enough people that the incapacity conversation starts spreading. 2. Institutional confidence fractures. In a serious external crisis, the public expects the executive branch to appear coordinated. When you see visible contradictions, anonymous briefings undermining official statements, agencies signaling different priorities, allies expressing confusion, commentators interpret it as internal breakdown. That's the environment where 25th Amendment talk is used as shorthand for the adults need to take the wheel. 3. Domestic politics weaponize the crisis. Foreign crises have always been used domestically. But in the current media ecosystem, the speed is unprecedented. A single Iran-related incident can become a 24-hour cycle of blame. You provoked it, you failed to deter it, you mishandled it, you lied about it, you hid it, you escalated it, you surrendered. In that environment, the most extreme claim, remove him, gets airtime because outrage is profitable and polarization is sticky. So where does Brennan fit in even hypothetically? If Brennan is indeed making comments, again, verify primary sources, his significance would not be procedural. It would be symbolic. He would function as a validator for a segment of the audience that trusts intelligence community voices, a lightning rod for the opposing segment that sees intelligence figures as political actors, and a bridge that connects foreign policy crisis to domestic legitimacy crisis in a single narrative. That's why these stories can explode. They fuse 2 anxieties at once, fear of war abroad and fear of disorder at home. But there's another layer you can't ignore, information operations. Anytime the 25th Amendment trends during a live international crisis, you have to consider whether parts of the conversation are being amplified deliberately by domestic actors, by foreign actors, or by automated networks, because chaos narratives weaken U.S. posture. If adversaries can convince markets and allies that Washington is unstable, they gain leverage without firing a shot. So the spread of removal narratives during an Iran crisis is, by definition, strategically useful to people who want the U.S. distracted and divided. That doesn't mean every claim is an op. It means the environment is perfect for amplification. So what should you conclude right now? Not it's happening, and not it's impossible. The correct conclusion is this: the system is under stress, and stress attracts legitimacy fights. The 25th Amendment is one of the sharpest legitimacy weapons available in American political language. which is why it surfaces when crises spike. And the real risk isn't that it succeeds overnight. The real risk is that it changes how everyone behaves. Cabinet officials become more cautious, messaging becomes more defensive, decisions become more politicized, and adversaries probe harder because they smell uncertainty. That is how domestic instability becomes a national security problem, regardless of whether Section 4 ever moves beyond talk. Here's what you should watch in the next 24 to 72 hours to determine whether this is just a hot headline cycle or something that is actually building inside institutions. First, primary source confirmation. If Brennan truly backs 25th talk, it should exist in a verifiable form. An interview clip, an official statement, or a published transcript. Secondary reporting and viral paraphrases are how misinformation thrives. Start with the source. Second, vice presidential posture. The vice president is the key actor in Section 4. If there is no sign, public or credibly reported, of vice presidential movement, then you are not watching a real Section 4 effort. You're watching political pressure theater. Third, cabinet alignment signals. You won't see cabinet members openly discuss Section 4 casually. If serious internal discussion is happening, the public-facing signs tend to be indirect, unusual schedule changes, coordinated statements emphasizing continuity, or leaks suggesting internal concern, but be careful. Leaks can be weaponized. Fourth, congressional leadership language. Serious Section 4 talk requires congressional math. Watch whether major leaders shift from general criticism to procedural language. Constitutional remedies, continuity of government, fitness, capacity. When rhetoric becomes procedural, the temperature is changing. Fifth, crisis management behavior on the Iran front. If the administration responds to Iran-related fallout with clear, consistent messaging and deconfliction-oriented actions, removal chatter often fades because the competence narrative stabilizes. If messaging becomes erratic and reactive, chatter grows because opponents gain material. Now, step back and look at the larger picture. This story is not really Brennan versus Trump. That's the click wrapper. The deeper story is that foreign crises can be converted into domestic legitimacy battles, and the 25th Amendment is one of the most extreme tools in that battle. So here's the question that should be sitting at the top of your mind as this develops. Is the 25th Amendment being raised because there's credible evidence of incapacity, or because an Iran-related crisis creates a political moment where removal narratives become useful? Those are two different worlds, and you can tell the difference by one thing: institutions moving quietly. If institutions don't move, it's a headline war. If institutions move, it's a constitutional crisis. Either way, once these conversations hit the public, they change incentives. They make everyone more defensive. They make allies more nervous. They make adversaries more opportunistic. And they make the crisis harder to manage, because now the fight isn't only about Iran, it's about authority.